In this video, we're going to be cutting, welding, and sanding. This is all the preparation bodywork before we tackle the actual paint. Strap in, this is going to be a little bit of a longer video. So a quick 30-second recap. My perfect original patina 1950 Buick got smashed in the ass. It took me a few years to gather up all the parts and the courage to do this repair. I started by getting the bumper, trunk, and the fender off of the car in the last video. Then I banged out the rear inner quarter, and then I started the work on the trunk. After I started cleaning up the trunk, I realized there was some bad rust in it. So here's where I cut out the bad outer skin on both sides. Now this trunk skin wraps around the inner structure. However, even though we have some rot all the way around to the backside, I'm not going to cut that out yet. Rather than fold over a piece of metal, I'm going to weld in a separate piece of metal to the back where it's necessary. It would be more difficult to fold the metal around the inner structure and line everything up, so doing it this way, I'll still have the same thickness in the area with a similar or even stronger strength. I use a wire wheel to clean up all the bigger chunks of rust, and then use some metal prep and rust converter before I seal up this area. I also found a bigger hole here on the inner structure, but I'm going to deal with that later. Here I just use some masking tape to act as the template to contour the shape of the missing metal. I then use a pencil to mark out as close as possible the shape that I'm going to actually need. I then transfer the tape over to this sheet of 18 gauge plate steel. Then I cut it out with a cutoff wheel. I get it close, but I use the grinder to do all the fine tuning. Then I test fit it and start to weld. Instead of bending it ahead of time, I'm going to bend it as I weld it. Now I'm most worried about blowing through this thinner old metal, and it does happen in a few areas, but I am able to get it filled back in with some extra welding. Now the most important thing is to not have the panel warp too much. This is going to happen every time you weld metal, so the best method that I've found is to do a stitch weld. After I tack it in, I skip around every inch or so around the part. This way you're spreading out the heat and allowing the metal to cool back down. Now, I probably should have hammered the stitches as I was going along. This actually relaxes the weld, but I barely know what I'm doing. Then I use a grinder to take down all the high spots. Now you have to be careful that you're just grinding at the weld and not the surrounding metal. You'll burn through that real quick too. Same process over on the other side. Now my stitches are far from perfect. There's a lot of bumps up and down to deal with, but I'll get that in a minute. First, I have to cut out this piece of rot on the inner structure. Oh, and when I flip over the trunk, I find a very old beer can. How'd that get there? So I make a little folded over piece to repair this part of the inner trunk. This will mimic the thickness and the shape of the folded over part of the outer skin. Once I weld it into place, it'll look like one outer skin piece that's folded over the inner structure. Here again, I stitch weld it and then grind back that weld. Now I move over to the other side where there's a little bit of a hole that needs to be addressed. So I cut away a rectangle of metal and I make a perfect little 18 gauge replacement plug for it. I use that tape method again and it fits perfect. But once I start welding, I'm blowing right through all of it. I can't turn my heat down anymore and I'm just making a bloody mess. And as I do a little digging, I find more Bondo here. So I said, screw it, let's just cut this whole corner out. I start exploring and find out how much I have to cut back. I end up taking it all the way past the actual drain hole. Now, I have no idea how to make a complex curve like this yet, so what I'm going to do is cut this corner off of my old trunk. That one's pretty useless now, so just this little part of it will live on in the new trunk. I mark it out with some tape, but I leave it a little larger just in case I get some more burn through on the new trunk. I just trim out a little more of the area on the new trunk and keep test fitting it until it fits perfect. I have to whack it with the hammer a little bit as the original trunk was so deformed in the accident. Now I clean the paint off of the edges of the original part and make any final adjustments. I grab a couple of magnetic clamps to hold it in place and I start tacking and stitching. There was actually one spot that I cut a little too short, so I used some TIG filler rod and I welded it into the gap to create a bridge. I don't know or really care if this is right or wrong, it worked. Once I flip the trunk back over, I hit the corners with some weld through primer and see how rough they are. Now the best course of action here would be to weld this again and grind it again, but some of the metal is just really thin here and I'm already having some problems blowing through it. So we're just going to have to live with a little bit of body filler. All of it's going to be way thinner than 1/8 of an inch when it's all said and done. Now before I go any further, I want to get all of this old primer paint off of this trunk. It's pretty pitted and it will not make a good surface, so let's clean it up. I use a grinder with a flap disc first. Then I use the palm sander to take it down a little bit finer. I clean it with some metal prep. And then I get some red primer on it. Now just like the inner fender, the trunk has a red base primer, so this is going to be our starting point. Okay, there's one coat of the red primer on here, and that's what we're actually going to use to try to mimic the rust and the primer show through on that one. Going to darken this a little bit. I think it needs to be a little bit more on the dark brown side. Kind of see there, that dark brown color in there. We still need to Bondo and repair these corners a little bit smoother. Here I do a few coats of body filler, followed by the sanding, and again I'm going to make this as thin as possible. I just want it to feather the edges and fill any leftover welding holes. Now, I know this looks like a large area, but the key is it's very, very thin. I put another coat of sealant primer on it, and then once that's done, I flip it over to finish up the underside. Same process here, we prime it, use some body filler, and then sand it all, trying to keep the body filler to a minimum. Okay, so that concludes the prep work on the trunk. All in all, I think it came out pretty decent. You can barely see where this corner was replaced. Once the patina's on it, it'll all disappear. Now I want to do all the final patina paint on everything at the same time, so we're going to move on to the fender and get it prepped. Now with the fender off, we can see a lot more of the damage that's been done here. This is really folded in, it should be out to about there. So this whole upper area is folded. Again, with the job that I did on the inner quarter, I suppose there's a possibility that I could bang this out, but I really just don't think it's going to happen. So that being said, what I found out is that this damage that occurred here in the section I have to remove actually occurs on what looks like a factory seam. So you can see right here from the factory there's a weld that actually goes right up here, goes right through the middle of this. You can see this little L shape right here, that's where the weld goes up, and right through here. And that's actually where the fender bent. It was right along that weld. So that weld is probably a little stronger. So when the metal got kinked, it got kinked right at that actual weld. So I'm probably gonna have to cut it back past the factory weld and then down. I might have to come here and then maybe just straight down this side. I have to get rid of this piece. So probably what'll happen, I might be able to just keep it super tight to this and come down here. Maybe that's what I'll do. Take away a little bit less material and see if I can get that to fit well. The biggest trick is I have to take that, wherever that cut is, I have to take that measurement and transfer it over to the 4-door fender and then be able to make that cut accurately. So really the next step is just to lop this off and see if we can transfer some of those measurements over to the other side. Okay, so I marked out where I think I'm going to cut. This kind of gives me the least amount of removal of old fender. I don't have to deal with this ridge right here in the body line. See that little bump right there? And what it does is it gives me about 3 inches, 4 inches of flat area to blend this paint from here to here. That's going to be the hardest thing, is just blending this into this spot here and making it not look like a big mess. So I should be able to sand the clear back to here and then use this pin line to re-clear and blend it off that way. And then we should be able to, I think I'm just past the kink here, so I think this will be okay. And then cut straight up this. What I'm going to do is try to measure on the other one from, if you look right here, this is right where this curves, and it's at the beginning of that curve. So I think if I measure right from there forward, I should be able to get that cut. Come right up here to this point and then angle down. And I think we'll be okay. So what I'm gonna do is just make sure these are all good. I'm gonna see if I can transfer this over to the 4-door fender. And just kind of take some measurements and see if some stuff lines up okay. Okay, so I made a little adjustment to the tape lines. And what we're actually gonna do to cut this is we're gonna cut it along this factory seam right here. And then I'm gonna cut up against this edge. This is all gonna get hidden underneath the bumper, and it's nice to have some of these welds being hidden. Then I'm going to cut from this point right here on this side of the line all the way up to this peak. And then from here, we're going to go straight across and down. We took some measurements to make sure that this angle was the same, and that this length was the same, and that this radius around this length is the same. We'll transfer that all over to this fender, and now we're going to do the same thing. Cut up here, down to this point right here, along this to this peak, and then up and around the edge. What I am going to do is I'm going to cut this fender first. This is the one that is going to be, has to be cut no matter what. And then once I'm done with that, recheck some of the measurements and just make sure that the transfers that we made to this fender work. I cannot even stress how nervous I am right now about cutting this fender, but we got to get it done. So let's get this thing cut open. No turning back now. What I did was I taped this one up at the exact measurements, and then I spray painted a line just so I knew where the tape was, and then backed everything off about 1/8 of an inch. That's going to accommodate for my blade width. Realistically, my blade is only about 1/16 of an inch wide, but I wanted just a little bit of room for adjustments. So hopefully this will all line up nice. Really, these first two cuts I'm not worried about, all the way up to here. And then the only thing I'm worried about is keeping this one in the straight line and making sure it lines up. This point right here is right where the very last bit of this turns around. So we should be just on the tip of that. Tip of that spot right there. So let's swap fenders and get this one cut. Oddly, the more nerve-wracking is cutting the new old stock fender. I do have that second fender just in case, but I'd like to keep it as like a backup. It is a pretty good condition whole fender, and this is just a 4-door fender, so it was a little easier to track down than the 4-door fender. So, all right, let's get this cut and see what happens. Hopefully everything lines up well. Let's give it a shot. There's the locked off back panel. Well, let's hope they fit. Okay, so this piece is set in place inside the other fender. I just have it clamped right now in a couple spots. And you can see in there, it's actually just overlapped a little bit on the inside.
because we let this cutoff piece a little long, it now tucks back to about here or so. So now what I'm going to do is scribe a new line where the two fenders meet, and now we'll be able to get a good cut. This was the only way to get this done because there was no way to measure up these two, and because that other piece was so damaged, I couldn't take it and put it on top of this and try to like guess where the line was. So I just had to take a bunch of measurements, a bunch of angles, figure out all of the information where it's going to go. Okay, so I sprayed a little bit of paint on there and then went back in with an X-Acto knife and just scribed to the edge. Let's get these clamps off and get the last little bit cut off.
The test fit is okay, but maybe just a bit off. I mess around with it for a while and it seems pretty close though. The way the fender is laying, it kind of deforms slightly. Imagine a taco starting to untaco. So even when I'm clamping it, it kind of just wants to open back up. So the best thing I can do is get some tack welds in here to hold it in place. So first let's sand back the paint a bit. Now I'm getting pretty confident that this is going to work, but there's just this one area that looks off. I believe that the four-door fender is probably just using a different die for the initial molding of the fender. In fact, I'm sure of it. There's no way that they could use the same die for both doors. So there's a little bit of a difference in the two of them as far as the shape of this upper crown. I think the four-door is just slightly lower. They're not aligning 100%, but they're pretty close. They're really just off by about 1/8 of an inch or so. And I'm hoping as the metal reacts to the welding, I'm going to be able to move the metal up a bit and make up that gap. I clamp and replace and trim this thing a bunch of times until I'm finally satisfied with the placement of it. So let's start welding.
But what we're going to do is put a couple tack welds in here and then go ahead and do that onto the fender. The fender's wanting to open up like this and we want to curve it back in a little, so we're going to have to apply a little force to hold it back the way it's supposed to go.
Again, I'm using the stitches to keep the heat down because we want as little heat transfer as possible. I am probably going a little too much, and I also realized that my heat is a little high, so I ended up turning it down a little bit as I got towards the end of the process. This top part of the curve in the metal seemed thinner, probably as it was bent into shape, so I was having a lot of problem with the weld blowing right through it. Eventually I got it dialed in, and it's nice and solid. Again, the four-door fender seems to have a little less contour here, so there's a slightest dip in that area. So I built it up with a little bit of weld, but ultimately it will get some body filler in there.
Alright, there is the fender almost fully welded out. There's a couple little spots where I got some blow through. I'm going to go back and clean those up. I'm just getting tired and rushing, so I want to slow down. But yeah, pretty much all good to go. We're going to get this weld all polished down and see how it looks.
After I get it all grinded back, most of this repair is pretty seamless.
Okay, so there are a few spots where the holes haven't been filled all the way. Sometimes they were blow-throughs where the welder got too hot and blew a hole in it. This metal up here is really thin compared to some of the other spots because when it's put in the press, it gets really stretched right here. So the thinness of the metal is drastically more here than it is on the side. You can see right here, I mean, we were almost perfect on that spot. And then here it started to pull a little bit. Here, it wasn't too bad. I'm a little low on the panel here, so we probably need to fill this a little And then I'll have to do some welding down here, and then I have to do some welding down here where I didn't finish up. So basically we need to get the welder back out, and we're going to just re-tack along some of these spots here, make sure all the holes are filled. There's just a couple here, a couple down here, and then a few at the bottom. And then we'll see if we can't get this into a little bit better shape. Otherwise, not too bad though so far.
I do some more fine tuning of the welds and grind back all the high spots. The majority of this repair looks pretty seamless right now, so I'm going to go ahead and hit it with some etching primer to see where all the low and high spots are. Next, we're going to get a coat of body filler on it. Once that's dry, I knock down the high spots with some heavy 60 grit sandpaper, and then go down to 200 and 400 to smooth it all out. One more coat of primer followed by some more filler. And after that's all done, I sand it back down. Then I shoot it with some black to finish out the prep work. While the trunk and the inner quarter have a red oxide primer, the original fender is actually primered in black, so that's the base that we're going to start with on it. Okay, that's going to wrap up this video for now. The next step is going to be getting the green matched paint on the car and replicating the original patina. So that will be the epic video that you don't want to miss. Once again, thank you for watching, and please be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you the next time.